Hello and welcome to the Non-Static Podcast, where we explore how to keep moving forward when motivation feels distant. Here we dive into finding peace and fulfillment in a busy world, discovering how to embrace life's opportunities to live with purpose and joy. I'm John. This is my brother Josh.
Howdy.
And this is Non-Static. We are here to talk about things that matter, to clear some clutter, right?
Yeah, to talk about whatever I want to talk about.
Absolutely.
Or whatever we want to talk about, I should say.
Yeah. How was your weekend?
It was just fine. Nothing too significant to report. It was laid back and quiet. How about yours?
No basketball tournaments. My girls aren't. Well, I'm sad because you had a basketball tournament, or your kids had
Just
a basketball tournament.
varsity basketball game, yeah. It
Yeah.
was good.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Getting to the end of the year. No, we didn't win.
Okay.
But getting to the end of the year, so it'll be nice to... The basketball season is a long slog sometimes, so it'll be good to...
Yeah. Super low key for me
Move
for the weekend, so that was nice. It was kind of a nice weekend to just do not a whole lot.
We live really boring lives.
I know. I know. Oh well. So what are we talking about today?
I saw a really interesting article. I think it's worth bringing up, and I'll link to it in the notes, I suppose. But it did some research on ADHD, and I do a lot of ADHD evaluations, and so it's kind of I wouldn't say it's a hot button topic, but it's something that parents are aware of, particularly with kids. But the research has shown that ADHD, if left untreated, can cut life expectancy by up to 9 years.
9? How is that possible?
Well, the research is showing a correlation between untreated ADHD, essentially, and then a reduction in the lifespan by approximately 9 years, which is about the same impact, believe it or not, as smoking or heavy drinking.
Jeez.
Yeah, and
that's crazy. Just having a hard time staying on task and staying, that can cause. I mean, there's obviously more to it than that.
Well, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder, and so the part of the brain that helps us sustain our attention, or the executive functioning part of our brain, isn't working correctly for people with ADHD. And we often see it as a childhood learning issue. But then we wonder, well, why does it have such a big impact on something as big as the lifespan or how long we live? So it's important to note that ADHD is more than just a hyper kid that can't sit still.
Right.
Kids in general tend to be pretty high energy. I'm sure you've learned.
I sure have.
But ADHD kind of goes beyond that. It's not just an inability to sit still. That's a big part of it for kids that are hyperactive, certainly. But really, ADHD affects the executive functioning part of our brain. And really, executive functioning is the ability of our brains, or people individually. It refers to their ability to use information in their environment effectively to make good decisions, or to interact successfully with their environment. And for kids with ADHD, or people with ADHD, I should say, that executive functioning piece is impaired to a degree. And it's more difficult for individuals to handle things such as impulse control, regulate their emotions, and even engage with long-term decision making. If you can't focus on the one thing in front of you, like someone with ADHD has difficulty doing, how are you able to engage with more long-term thinking and planning? And so
that makes sense.
When you look at it from the standpoint of executive functioning, you can see why it may relate to impaired decision making over the course of lifespan, which in turn can reduce lifespan expectancy.
So when you say that they can be more impulsive, or do they have a tendency to? They have a propensity to engage in high risk stuff, stuff that could be potentially dangerous.
Possibly, I think.
Because that'd be a good reason to have a lower life expectancy.
Right.
Do a lot of stupid stuff.
Yeah,
a lot of dangerous stuff.
And I'm not saying everybody with ADHD is destined for a life of poor decisions and whatnot, but what we find on average is they're at higher risk for that kind of stuff. So
Sure.
They're at higher risk for more accidents and injuries, for example, if they're not paying attention or aren't able to concentrate on something the way they should. They have a higher risk of that. There's also a higher rates of addiction for individuals with ADHD.
And why is that?
Well, a lot of times, particularly as we get older, if ADHD is untreated or unidentified, people will essentially self-medicate. They'll use some kind of substance to help them achieve that concentration or ability to focus that they're lacking.
Interesting.
The interesting thing about ADHD is psychostimulants are extremely good at treating ADHD in general.
Like Adderall.
Adderall. Yep.
Right.
Adderall is a big one, the big buzzword that we talk about. But really, Adderall is a form of amphetamine.
Right.
And it's very good for someone with ADHD. It's very good at helping them concentrate and helping calm down that hyperactivity. But if it's untreated, for a number of reasons, why is it not caught? Why is it not treated well? Sometimes parents just chalk it up to a kid just being high energy. Yep.
Right.
Kids being kids. And there is some truth to that. I mean, I think we have to be very careful that we don't overdiagnose it. Or overdiagnose or overtreat kids that just because they have high energy doesn't mean they have ADHD.
Right.
But for kids and people that have genuine impairments with their concentration, their ability to sustain their attention and concentrate related to ADHD, the early detection and treatment can be really helpful for them. But if it's not, what the research has found is that people with ADHD that's untreated, they tend to self-medicate using other forms of substances. Not all cases, but it just means that there's that higher risk of or higher rate of addiction in the population of people with ADHD.
Well, if they don't have addiction to either illicit drugs or prescription drugs, it probably could come out as like extreme caffeine intake.
Yeah,
I imagine, because I have heard that caffeine can help level them out.
It does, yeah.
Okay.
One of the people are going to go around using caffeine as a way to diagnose ADHD now, but one thing that they've found is that kids with genuine ADHD, the impact of caffeine when their kid consumes caffeine, or their child consumes caffeine, I should say, it has the opposite effect of getting them hyper. It actually calms them down. Whereas for the typical child, if you give them a can of Mountain Dew or Monster Energy, you'll be paying for it for a long time.
Oh my
but
gosh, yeah.
A lot of times with kids with ADHD, the use of caffeine actually, because caffeine's a stimulant, actually calms them down.
So how does a stimulant actually calm? How does a stimulant calm people with ADHD down? It just does. To me, that just doesn't make sense. Well, obviously, like you were saying, there's an impairment in the executive functioning. But is it like a physical difference in their brain?
Yeah. So the reason psychostimulants work is because it acts on the function of the brain that helps calm us down. And so it's kind of the best way to. It's a really long conversation that probably goes beyond the scope of this particular podcast. Right. But essentially, the ADHD brain works the opposite way that yours and my brains do. You and I don't have ADHD, I don't think. So our response to caffeine, for example, or any stimulant is going to be much different than someone with ADHD.
Right.
So it's very fascinating. It's very fascinating how the psychostimulants work.
So kind of a little bit of a detour, just a 30-second here. Mm-hmm. What about for people who just don't really feel any impact from consuming caffeine? Could that be an indication that they might have ADHD, or is it just like their body processes it differently? Because I can drink, 400 milligrams of caffeine, and all I get is just like, my heart just starts going crazy, but I don't get more energy. If anything, I get tired.
Well, you just said that you feel your heart going crazy and getting anxious. I would say that you are responding to the caffeine piece, but the quote-unquote energy hit, nobody gets energy from caffeine. It's a superficial, artificial energy hit. Nobody gets energy from it. It doesn't produce energy, but it creates the illusion that we're more energetic. And what's happened for you is you've become normalized to it, and your body's gotten used to the what caffeine does, and so the energy hit is gone, but it still increases the heart rate, makes you feel more anxious, all those things.
All the bad stuff.
Yeah. Okay. And people metabolize caffeine differently. Some people have caffeine for them has a very short half-life, whereas others has a very long half-life, and it really depends on. It all depends upon how your specific metabolism specifically related to caffeine.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Fascinating.
So,
interesting.
Yep.
All right.
But kind of getting back to ADHD and how it impacts life expectancy. there's this kind of, we've talked about it briefly on the podcast before, but you kind of look at um, this idea of lots of really small decisions add up to bigger things down the road. And that's kind of the way what they're finding is with ADHD, particularly ADHD that's not treated, a lot of little actions or small actions over the course of years add up to this problem down the road. And that's where the life expectancy things comes from. Now you're looking at an average of life expectancy. So you have very extreme cases where people with ADHD lose their attention and they have a traumatic car accident, right? That's obviously going to skew this. So that's really what they're identifying is kind of these more, they're at higher risk of more significant accidents, for example, or making decisions that maybe aren't in their best interest.
So it's not necessarily their physical, their physical body breaks down or it's more damaging to them. It's just that, hey, bigger risk takers or just lack of attentiveness.
Partially, yeah, lack of attentiveness. And if you look at, say, for someone with ADHD, they'll often tell you that I just have a hard time concentrating and motivating myself to do things that aren't interesting to me. So you look at someone with ADHD and they have that difficulty making a decision, they have difficulty focusing, they have difficulty planning and goal-directed behavior to the same extent that you and I do. It's always difficult to engage in goal-directed behavior, but it's even more difficult for individuals with ADHD. And then, so you look at all these little decisions that add up over the course of your lifetime. The ability to exercise. They've also been found that individuals with untreated ADHD have a higher risk of heart disease, obesity, and diabetes due to poor self-care, for example.
Because of a lot of binging? Or
no, because of the inability to concentrate and focus and to do that next mundane thing that's not interesting. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. People with ADHD are very good at engaging in behavior that they're interested in.
Right.
You look, the stereotype is the ADHD kid that can't sit still in school, but can sit in front of a PlayStation for hours and hours on end, seemingly be able to concentrate on a very complex video game, but they can't do that in school.
Right.
It's also related to the interest level. And so really ADHD is a difficulty sustaining your attention on something that's perhaps not as interesting.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But how does it compare to smoking or alcoholism?
That's really related to the risk-taking behavior. So if you look at someone, and I don't mean to lump everybody into one category, but if you look at a smoker, for example, that's a very poor habit.
Right.
Okay. We all know that, and you can talk to any smoker.
I shouldn't do
this.
This.
They know that they shouldn't be doing it, right? That's why we call them coffin nails. But over time, the smoking over time adds up to poor health problems, and that's kind of what they're finding with ADHD is over the course of someone's lifespan, the difficulty making decisions or the difficulty concentrating on things that may be healthier for them adds up over time to lead to increased risk for things such as, heart disease or obesity, that kind of thing.
That makes sense.
So, it's kind of the article kind of generally speaks to it, but what it's trying to draw your attention to is, small decisions over a very long period of time have really significant impacts on our lives. The decisions we start making in our 20s and the habits we have in our 20s, if that's an unhealthy habit, 40 years
that catches up.
It's going to catch up with you. And that's what they're finding with ADHD.
Do you find that social media kind of contributes to, or it can exacerbate the problem? Because with TikTok, there's such short videos, and that I guess just from my unprofessional mind, to me it would seem it's fish mentality, goldfish mentality, 15-cent video clips. They don't really have a chance to they don't have a chance to really test their focus ability to concentrate on something longer than 15-20 seconds. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I would just kind of lump that into the category of someone's interest levels in something. How I mentioned a little bit before, the kids with ADHD, they can't concentrate in school, but they can sure concentrate on that video game for hours on end. TikTok and social media are the same thing.
Okay.
It just kind of provides that dopamine hit. ADHD is really a disorder of being able to pay attention to what you don't really find that interesting on a lot of levels.
Right.
People with ADHD have a superpower of being able to be hyper-focused on things that they're passionate about.
Right.
But it's all those other things that aren't quite as interesting to people with ADHD that they struggle with.
We all have to figure out the discipline piece.
Yeah, but someone with ADHD, it's much more difficult than it would be for a typical person that isn't experiencing that disorder, if that makes sense.
Yep, sure does.
So other examples of habits that are difficult for people with ADHD to engage in, things like maintaining healthcare routines. If you're not that interested in running or going to the gym or eating right, it's going to be much more difficult for someone with ADHD to sustain that habit over time. And then people with ADHD tend to be under higher levels of stress. Again, this is people that are with untreated ADHD.
Right.
And there's a big connection between very high stress levels and chronic illnesses, and that's something we've been aware of for a very long time.
Cortisol is
if if we're very highly stressed, the chronic illnesses are going to follow, and we see this particularly in Western culture. Our lives are so fast-paced, our lives are so high stress that we're seeing this absolute explosion of chronic illnesses.
Heart disease.
And we're
it's a huge one.
We're really not really sure how to reckon with that at this point. But there's a direct link between high stress levels and chronic illnesses. And someone with ADHD that doesn't have it treated properly, it's even more significant for them because of the inability to concentrate and pay attention.
Yeah, the pace of the world just keeps on accelerating, it seems.
Yeah. So it's kind of like a snowball effect, Right. One little decision isn't going to make a big deal, but when you start balling them all up together, suddenly this thing grows and they compound over time.
Right. Just like that.
Making it harder.
Just like that financial debt snowball analogy.
Yep. Yeah. Small, the $8 a day Starbucks latte won't necessarily bite you right now, but 20 years from now, if you do that every single day, that's a big snowball.
That's a massive snowball that should go in your Roth IRA or something like that and compound.
I do love my Starbucks.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But anyway, you get my point. Is we don't, like on a given day, we don't see that $8 as having too big of a significant impact on us. But when you start adding it up over time,
it really adds up. It adds up pretty fast. It really, quite frankly, it really does.
Yeah, yeah. Couple other things I just want to touch on regarding ADHD is oftentimes people don't realize that they have ADHD until later in life. A lot of times it's not caught. People with ADHD are typically highly intelligent individuals, and so a lot of people with ADHD can kind of skate by, so to speak, with being able to compensate for their poor concentration because of their cognitive abilities. Some people would call ADHD, there's like a gift side of ADHD, which includes like creativity, spontaneity, and resilience for specific tasks. If someone with ADHD is very passionate about something, like I mentioned before, they have that ability to be laser focused on something to the expense of all else. So it's just important to keep that in mind. Also interesting is that there's a big gender gap in the diagnosis of ADHD. As you might guess, boys are diagnosed with ADHD at a much higher rate than girls are.
Yeah.
And it's important to also remember that
they want to go and work with their hands.
Well, there's three types of ADHD.
Oh, okay.
There's the inattentive type.
Right.
Okay. There's the hyperactive type, and there's the combined type. So typically boys tend to fall, and I'm speaking very generally, but boys tend to fall on the hyperactive side of things, whereas girls tend to fall more on the inattentive side of things.
Interesting.
You're going to notice that hyperactive kid in the classroom much more than you're going to notice the inattentive kid. The ADHD inattentive type is going to be the kid that sits in the back of the classroom and kind of daydreams.
Right.
And when most people think of ADHD, they don't think of the daydreamer. They think of the hyperactive kid that can't sit still.
Right.
And is running around the room, for example, or running down the hall, or engaging in impulsive decision making.
Right. That's all
That's
boys.
Creating a problem.
That's all boys until
to an extent, yeah.
Right.
But there's also that inattentive side that a lot of times people aren't noticing, and it can come out as, well, they're just struggling with learning, But when really the issue isn't their learning abilities, the issue is their inability to concentrate.
Interesting. Okay.
In the moment, so it's just interesting. So what do you do with ADHD? The first thing is you have to make sure is that you catch it early with the right interventions.
Right.
I think historically we've been very quick to overdiagnose ADHD, I would say. But that's not the reason to not look at it and consider it.
Right, for a while there, it seemed like everyone had ADHD and were getting their Adderalls. And
there was a time when Adderall first came out, especially
like
in the 90s, I believe it was, that it was being handed out kind of like candy,
Right.
And
well, it kind of was a miracle drug for people who had ADHD and people who didn't have ADHD.
Right.
But definitely high use for misuse.
What's also important to note is that treating ADHD is more than just a psychostimulant. There's medications certainly have a big role in it, but there's also this skill building piece of people with ADHD, and any of us for that matter that has struggled with inattention, there's strategies that you can use and skills that you develop with the person to help them sustain their attention. Things like, working for shorter chunks of time and taking breaks.
Mm-hmm.
That's good for anybody. Most of us aren't able to work uninterrupted for hours on end without a break. So learning how to strategically take breaks from your work, for example, is an excellent way to deal with the inattention that comes along with ADHD. Is
a good time to, just kind of a random thought about that, is a good time to take a break at work if you're working hard on something, all of a sudden you find yourself honestly going to different tabs that you probably shouldn't be going to on your browser. Like, it's really not that productive. Or is it kind of like that's your sign, like, hey, I need to take a few minute break, just
yeah,
take a breather and then go back at it, or just kind of like, nope, I gotta get myself right back onto what I'm working on and power through, or you just like give yourself the ability to have a few minutes when you're wandering.
What I would say to that is if you find your mind wandering, it's best just to take a complete break from it altogether.
Yeah. Otherwise, you're just going to be wasting your time.
Exactly. And we tend to get caught in these loops of, I'm going to check my email, and then I'm going to look at this, and that's going to open this tab, and then I got to check my email again, and then I got to check my messages, and then I got to check my email again, and then I got to get back to my task. Oh, but then there's this other notification that came through. So it really, the concept of concentration, we could maybe do a podcast on this sometime, but it's about managing the distractions that you allow into your life. Our brains are really good at filtering out distractions in our environment, but the problem with computers and screens is it's impossible to not see them unless you take an active role in turning them off.
Right.
And so it's really the ability to do good work without free of distractions is really setting yourself up for success. So rather than opening up a tab, having numerous tabs open, is closing them all out and having just the one tab open that you really need to work on.
Sometimes I kind of wonder if our computer screens kind of contribute to that. We have ultra mega super wide screens so we can enhance our productivity, but man, there's enough to put everything on there all at once.
There is, and it's all about strategically managing all that, because there's plenty of distractions.
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
there's
no matter how big your screen are, or how many or how few you have.
Yeah. Yep.
What's a good way for what are some things that parents can do to help try to manage a child's ADHD without medication, without if there comes a point where your child needs something, then they need something, but I would imagine you want to do like a medication-free, drug-free options first.
Well, you certainly don't want to run to medications, because medications certainly, you really have to weigh it's really a cost-benefit analysis. What is the benefits to a certain treatment compared to what are the negatives of it? The well-known negatives for ADHD treatment is that, for example, it eliminates appetite for some kids.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're weighing this, if this poor kid is just unable to concentrate and is super hyperactive and impulsive to their detriment, you can give them, perhaps the medication will work, but then you have to weigh that against, well, if it's impacting their appetite and they won't eat, then
Right.
you're getting dabbling into the developmental
too.
piece. So it's really, I hesitate to go in to say do this rather than medications, because I think it's really on a case-by-case basis.
That's something you should be talking with your medical professional about anyways.
What I would say is ADHD, one of the hallmarks of ADHD is that the impulsivity or the inattention or the symptoms have to be present in more than one setting. So, for example, and there are cases where the kid may be completely unable to concentrate at school, is hyperactive in school, but at home they're just fine. For example,
Right.
That's an extreme case, but it doesn't need to be present in more than one setting. So typically, if we find that symptoms disappear in one setting compared to another, we kind of look at, well, why are they acting that way in this one particular setting?
Sure.
What's kind of driving that? I would argue that, not to throw our whole education system under the bus, but young kids in particular are meant to move, and they're meant to play, and they're meant to explore through play. Whereas we as a society, we try to pigeon-toe them into a classroom, and you all need to sit still now and listen and do your work and that kind of thing. And our education system really hasn't changed a whole lot in the past several decades.
Mm-hmm.
We still have these big classes, and we still are trying to teach them to sit still and pay attention and all those things. And we're not naturally geared towards that. I'm not saying that there's anything necessarily wrong with it. It's just good to be aware that not everybody is going to function very well in that environment. You're going to have some kids that flourish in that environment.
Right.
And you're going to have some that just aren't. And it's important to note that just because a child isn't naturally inclined to function well in a classroom setting all the time, doesn't mean they necessarily have something wrong with them. It's just kind of figuring out what strategies can we use to mitigate that. And I will say, the teaching profession in particular has identified this.
Right.
A lot. If you go to most classrooms now, teachers bend over backwards to make a environment that's inviting for kids, that lets them bounce around and get their wiggles out, for example.
Right.
My kindergartner's classroom is a perfect example.
Right.
There's no desks in there at all.
Circles on the floor, colored circles.
Yeah, and so teachers do an excellent job at doing that, but the whole education system as a whole isn't necessarily supporting it.
Right.
They just look
I've
at
noticed that
numbers
over the
and
past few years, the schools have really put a renewed focus on STEM. Stuff, and I do know that's more hands-on for
learning by doing. Yeah.
That's sure. Those were my favorite. I mean, I don't think we had STEM. I don't think it wasn't called STEM when we were in school, but man, the workshops that I did, welding and CAD drafting, hands-on stuff, actually creating stuff.
Yeah.
That's learned far more.
Yeah.
Than what I learned in English and math.
Well, and what that's coming from is not years ago, but 10, 20 years ago, the big focus was you're going to school so you can go to college later.
Right.
And that's great. College is great. Obviously, I went to college. You went to college.
Mm-hmm.
Those are great things, but not everybody is cut out to go to college, and that's okay. And so you're seeing this renewed focus on, hey, there's other options rather than a 4-year university. There's this whole world.
In many cases, better options.
Yeah, there's this whole world called the trades out there.
Yeah.
And there are some people that are there's some people that are geared more towards academic, in-class studying type learning, and then there's other kids that are more hands-on, physical type labor stuff. And so that's why you're seeing this explosion of the trades out there, because there's this recognition that, colleges are great, but there's also this whole other, there's all these other industries that are just as lucrative, that are more geared towards people that don't want a sit-down job necessarily, or don't want to sit in class all day. That's okay.
I would say I'm definitely in the latter. Like, if I had my choice, which I guess I do have a choice, but I'm probably most fulfilled when I'm working with my hands doing stuff. So like whenever I'm home, I'm just always puttering around, looking for things wanting to fix things, wanting to improve on things, just because I like creating, I like fixing and all that kind of stuff. But
Yep.
Interesting.
Yep. So all that to say, just to kind of pull it all together, it's important to think of ADHD. When we think of ADHD, we always think of the ADHD kid. But ADHD is not just a childhood issue. It obviously doesn't go away. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder, which means people that have ADHD, you don't acquire ADHD later in life. The popular term, I've heard the term used of adult ADHD. I think what they're identifying is that I didn't realize I had this until I was an adult, but someone with true ADHD has had it since birth. That's why it's called a neurodevelopmental disorder.
Okay.
And actually the criteria is the clinician there has to be evidence that this disorder was present during the developmental years, which is essentially birth through age 6 or so. Okay. During those formative developmental years, where obviously we develop over the lifespan, but those formative development years, there has to be some evidence that there was an attentional disorder at that time. But anyway, just because it's present as a kid doesn't mean it disappears suddenly when you magically turn 18. It's obviously a lifelong condition that people with that disorder have to learn how to manage. And you do that through concentration skills, sometimes with medication, but it's important to make sure that you're aware of how to manage it. And it's also the whole reason of bringing up that article, and again, I'll post to it in the notes, is to shed light on the fact that it does, for people that it's not treated, does play a big impact on their lives, sometimes in negative ways.
Right. So pay attention to your body, pay attention to your kids.
Yep.
And if you feel like something is off, if you feel like you or someone you love might have some symptoms of it, it's worth getting an evaluation done.
Yeah.
Just because if you don't have it, great. Then you just need to work on discipline or work on focusing a little bit better or what have you, or whatever works best for you or your child. And if you do have it, well, then now you know, and then you can work on reducing those unnecessary risks. Yeah. And your risk taking and be that superhuman that you are.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Yep. Cool. Any other final thoughts, Josh?
That's all I got for you today. That's all I got for you today.
Well, thanks, guys, for tuning into this episode of the Non-Static Podcast. If you want to stay connected to us and dive deeper into finding peace, focus, and fulfillment, just be sure to sign up for the Non-Static newsletter at nonstatic.org, or subscribe and like these podcasts wherever you listen to them. I know Spotify, Apple Podcasts, as well as YouTube. And just as a reminder, if you or somebody you know is struggling with their mental health or substance use, or you would like to inquire more about ADHD testing, go ahead and give us a call anytime at Inspire Services. And if we can't help you, if we don't have space, then we would love to refer you to one of our many like-minded providers that we can refer out to. So. Take care. Keep moving forward.
Enjoy the journey.